Take out your phone, open your banking app, look at the number on the screen. That number, whatever it is, represents something that does not exist, not in any physical sense, not anywhere you can point to, not in a vault somewhere, not in a safe, not in a building with your name on it. It exists because a series of computers, operated by institutions that most people have never visited, agree that it exists, and as long as everyone continues to agree, it does. The moment they stop agreeing, it doesn't. This is money, the most powerful social technology in human history, an invention so abstract, so completely dependent on collective agreement that it should not work at all, and yet, here you are, exchanging invisible agreements for food, for shelter, for the device you are holding right now. Now imagine your wallet is completely useless. Your phone is worthless. Every number on every screen is meaningless. You have walked 3 days to reach a group of people you have never met. You have a piece of meat, fresh, valuable, but heavy, and beginning to turn. They have a stone tool, sharp, perfectly made, something you need desperately. How do you get it? Because for most of human history, that was the question, and the answer to that question is the story of how money was invented long before anyone called it money, long before it had a name at all. Here is what makes this topic genuinely strange. Money, as we use it today, is not a thing. It is a belief, a shared hallucination, a story that works because enough people agree to participate in it. The dollar bill in your pocket has no inherent value. It is a piece of paper, or more accurately these days, it is an entry in a database, a number. Its value exists entirely in the collective agreement of billions of people who have decided, without any formal vote, without any conscious moment of choice, that this number means something. And what is extraordinary is that this is not new. The collective agreement that gives value to objects is one of the oldest cognitive operations that human beings perform. And it predates coins, it predates agriculture, it predates writing, it predates almost everything we think of as civilization. Here is the question that I want you to hold for the next 10 minutes, because I am going to come back to it. At what moment does a shell, or a tooth, or a piece of volcanic glass stop being a shell, a tooth, or a piece of volcanic glass, and become money? That transition, that invisible cognitive moment, is one of the most important things that ever happened in human history, and nobody was there to notice it when it occurred. By the end of this, you will understand how trade began, how it broke apart the logic of small group survival, how it created wealth and inequality and social status for the very first time in human history, and you will understand why the number on your phone screen is not as different from a Neanderthal's shell necklace as you might think. To understand the invention of money, you first have to understand what came before it. And what came before money was not barter. This is a myth that economists have been correcting for decades. The idea that human beings naturally began by bartering, trading goods directly, one for one, and then eventually invented money to make that process easier, is almost certainly backwards. Anthropologist David Graeber, in his landmark work on the history of debt, spent years looking for historical evidence of barter economies, economies where strangers regularly traded goods without any form of currency, and found almost none. Not because barter never existed, but because barter, as a primary economic system, requires something that strangers almost never have. A coincidence of wants. I have exactly what you need, and you have exactly what I need at the same time, in the same place, in the right quantities. This coincidence is extraordinarily rare, and building an economy on rare coincidences does not work. What actually came before money, before barter, before any formal exchange system, was something far more human and far more sophisticated than economists have traditionally given credit for. Mutual aid within small hunter-gatherer groups, the groups that were the dominant social structure for most of human existence. There was no exchange. There were no transactions. There was no keeping track of who owed what to whom. There was production and there was sharing. The successful hunter brought back meat, and the meat was distributed not as payment for past services, not in expectation of future services, but because that is what the group did, because the group's survival was not individual, it was collective. Research on modern hunter-gatherer societies, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Kung of the Kalahari, shows that sharing within the group is not generous. It is not a virtue. It is an expectation so fundamental that it does not feel like a choice. Hoarding within the group, accumulating more than your share, is not just selfish, it is bizarre. It is the behavior of someone who has misunderstood what kind of creature they are and what kind of situation they are in. In these societies, the concept of individual wealth, of having more than others as a permanent state, simply does not exist. Not because people are saints, but because the group is small enough and interdependent enough that everyone can see what everyone has, and everyone knows that what protects them individually is not their personal stockpile, but the health and capability of the people around them. The most valuable thing you can have in a hunter-gatherer group is not possessions. It is reputation. Specifically, the reputation of being someone who gives, who contributes, who can be counted on, because that reputation is what ensures that when you need something, when you are sick or injured, or unlucky in the hunt, the group will provide for you. This is not altruism. This is a social insurance system, running without a formal structure, without paperwork, without any explicit agreement, but with extraordinary effectiveness. And it worked for hundreds of thousands of years, in groups where everyone knew everyone, where the social bonds were tight enough to make defection costly, where hoarding was visible and punishable. This system produced communities that were, by some measures, more equitable than any human society that has existed since, but then something changed. And it began with a problem that the small group mutual aid system could not solve. What do you do when you need something from someone you have never met? Here is where the curiosity loop I opened closes. Because the answer to the question of when a shell becomes money is when you trade it to a stranger. Let's think about what happens when two groups of ancient humans from different territories meet. In the ancient world, strangers were dangerous, competition for resources was real, violence between groups was documented, and the social mechanisms that governed exchange within a group, the reputation systems, the mutual aid expectations, the long-term relationships, did not apply to strangers. You could not count on a stranger's generosity. You could not rely on a stranger's sense of obligation. You could not enforce social norms against someone you would never see again. And yet, the groups on opposite sides of a mountain range had different resources, different materials, different skills. And what one group had in abundance, another group might desperately need. The question of how to exchange between strangers without trust, without ongoing relationships, without any enforcement mechanism, is one of the fundamental problems of human social life, and the solution that emerged independently in cultures across the world with no contact with each other, was objects of shared symbolic value. The first forms of what we can reasonably call proto-currency were things that combined several specific properties: rarity, durability, portability, and symbolic significance. Rare cowrie shells, found at sites thousands of kilometers from the ocean, tell us that people were carrying them across vast distances, not to eat, not for any practical purpose, but because they were rare, beautiful, and recognized as valuable by the people they encountered. Obsidian, the volcanic glass that produced the sharpest cutting edges in the ancient world, was moved across trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers by people who had access to it to people who needed it, in exchange for something. We cannot always know what, but the exchange happened. Animal teeth, mammoth ivory, specific types of feathers. Archaeological evidence from sites around the world shows these objects appearing far from their places of origin, in contexts that suggest they were not just transported, but valued, kept, and eventually exchanged. This is the moment. This is when the shell stops being a shell and starts being something else, not because the shell changed, but because the human mind reached a new capacity, the capacity to agree with a stranger that this object, this specific, rare, portable, durable object, means something, has value, not because it feeds you, not because it protects you, but because we both believe it does, and because enough other people believe it that you can take it to a third person who has also never met you and exchange it for something you actually need. This is credit. This is value. This is, in the most fundamental sense, Money. The oldest known example of what researchers confidently call proto-currency are spondylus shells, found at sites across prehistoric Europe and the Middle East, dating back at least 6,000 years. But the trade networks that moved them suggest this was already a mature system by then. Not a new invention, but an established practice, one that had been developing for possibly much longer. And Blombos Cave in South Africa, which we discussed in another video, contains perforated shell beads dating to 80,000 years ago, worn as personal adornment, as identity markers. As a way of communicating status and group membership to strangers, the cognitive leap required to wear a shell as a signal of value is the same cognitive leap required to use a shell as currency, the understanding that objects can carry agreed-upon meaning beyond their physical properties may be 80,000 years old or older. So what happened when symbolic value, proto-currency, spread? What changed when humans could suddenly exchange with strangers? The first thing that changed was the reach of human cooperation. The mutual aid system of the small group worked because everyone knew everyone. Trust was personal, enforced by ongoing relationships, and by the social cost of defection. Proto-currency extended cooperation beyond the group. For the first time, you could obtain something from someone you had never met and would never meet again, without violence, without coercion, through a transaction that both parties could choose to enter and both parties benefited from. This is not a small thing. This is the foundation of every trading relationship, every market, every economic system that has ever existed. The moment when human cooperation scaled beyond the group and became possible between strangers is one of the most important transitions in human history, but it came with a cost. The second thing that changed was the possibility of inequality. In the small group mutual aid system, accumulation was impossible. Everything you had was visible, and visible excess was socially punished. But proto-currency, by its nature, was portable and concealable. A pocket full of cowrie shells does not announce itself, does not demand to be shared, does not trigger the group's distribution instincts. For the first time in human history, it became possible to have more, and for that having more to be invisible and inheritable. The first archaeological evidence of what researchers recognize as wealth inequality appears around the same time as the first evidence of systematic trade. Not coincidentally, certain graves from the Neolithic period, around 10,000 years ago, contain dramatically more objects than others, more tools, more ornaments, more prestige goods, objects that had been carried far from their place of origin, at significant cost. This is not random distribution. This is the material signature of a society that has developed the concept of owned value, of wealth as a personal property that can be accumulated and passed down. The concept of the rich and the poor is not a product of capitalism or industrialization or the modern state. It is a product of the moment. When symbolic value was invented, when the shell became money, and money could be kept and kept secret and kept across generations, every system of human inequality that has existed since is built on that original cognitive invention. The agreement that certain objects have value beyond their physical properties, and the discovery that this agreement could be exploited by people who understood it better than others, or who controlled the objects that others agreed were valuable. Look at the number on your phone screen again. That number exists because of a collective agreement that has been building for 80,000 years, or longer. It started with a shell on a beach, in the hands of someone who understood, before anyone had the words to describe it, that this object, this rare, portable, beautiful object, could mean something to a stranger who had never seen them before and would never see them again. That shell became beads, and beads became teeth, and teeth became obsidian, and obsidian became cowrie shells, and cowrie shells became silver, and silver became coins, and coins became paper, and paper became numbers, and numbers became the figure on your screen. The chain is unbroken. Every link is the same cognitive operation, the agreement that something means more than it is. That value is not a property of objects, but a property of minds, of human minds, in agreement. And here is the thought I want to leave you with. The most powerful economic force in the world right now is not oil, not technology, not military power. It is consensus, the collective agreement of billions of people, that certain numbers mean something, that certain institutions can be trusted, that certain systems will continue to function tomorrow the way they function today, if that consensus fractures, if enough people stop agreeing, the numbers on everyone's screens become what they always were, arrangements of pixels, without meaning, without value, without any power at all. Money is not a thing. It is a story, the most successful story human beings have ever told, running continuously for 80,000 years. And the only thing keeping it running, is that enough of us still believe it? If this made you look at your wallet differently, share it with someone who has never thought about what money actually is. And I will see you in the next one.